Thank you all for coming, and also to all the people watching online and following on Twitter, which Jessica is taking care of, keeping everyone updated as the conversation develops. Welcome to this latest instalment of our free exchange, Art and Landscape, and continuation of the Outdoor Institute of Art, a 2-year programme conceived by Yasmin Canvin and run by Firmin Wood's Contemporary Art. The Outdoor Institute of Art is an alternative art school with discussion, skills and knowledge sharing events between artists, experts in relevant fields, the art sector and members of the public. For this free exchange, we are at East Carlton Park. East Carlton Park is situated on the northern ridge of Northamptonshire, overlooking the Welland Valley. After discovering the rich seam of iron ore in the area, Stewarts and Lloyd Limited established the steelworks in Corby during the 1930s, acquiring the grounds and hall at East Carlton to house the workers. The grounds were later acquired by Corby Borough Council and have become a country park open to the public. I'd now like to introduce you to our speakers. Onya McCausland is being funded by the Leverhulme Trust on a 3-year project at the Slade, and is an artist whose Turning Landscape into Colour project investigates the origins of earth pigments found across the UK and considers their significance as contemporary cultural materials. Onya explores the location, mapping and extracting of ochres from the landscape, on processing, manufacturing and naming individual sources of colour as vehicles for reintegrating people's experiences of place and establishing new connections between landscape and painting. Sue Barker is a member of Northamptonshire's Natural History Society's Geological Section, giving regular talks to members and co-leading a Geology for Beginners course for the University of the Third Age. After studying chemistry and geology with geochemistry and geophysics, Sue has taught all 3 of the sciences in both state and private schools. I'd now like to invite Onya and Sue to introduce themselves further and also to tell us a bit about their interests and viewpoints on the theme of art and landscape, after which we'll open the discussion to the audience. So Onya, if I could come to you first.
Okay, thank you for the introduction, and it's really nice to be in this amazing context and setting to talk about work which is so related to it, and the fact that this is a landscape which is about iron ore mining is really obviously very pertinent. By way of a kind of intro, a slight sort of preamble into the work that I'm doing now, it may be helpful to sort of say how I kind of arrived here. My current practice is very much about directly being involved and embedded, if you like, in the landscape, in different landscapes across the country. That's the way it is now, but it wasn't always like that. And in fact, it came from a practice which was very much concerned with the monochrome and with drawing practices and with minimalism and an investigation into the touch and the mark. And this all shifted quite radically when I was involved in a residency at Gloucester Cathedral. I had a year as artist in residence there, and what happened was I arrived with these sort of monochrome drawings that I was thinking about. They were made using a process of displacing the material using an eraser from one place to another. And this was to do with kind of rhythm and change and also touch and mark and a kind of a process of displacement through erasure. So so that was quite a kind of focused practice. And I found myself in this cathedral, and it was quite overwhelming because I just thought, well, what can I bring to this, and what can it bring to, how can I sort of work with this? How can I work with this material? And I noticed that there were these cut marks and traces of pigment on the cathedral walls. And the cut marks were the marks of chiselling the stone, and they resembled the mark that I was making drawings with. And the red pigment was the traces that remained after the wall paintings had been erased during the Reformation. So this red was the only remaining kind of relationship that was left, giving a kind of clue to this history of the place. And it was this encounter with material that completely shifted the way I started to think about making work, because it went right to the kind of heart of what I was doing, and yet it brought a kind of well of real content and real sort of presence to the work that I'd been making, which had been kind of very, very sort of stripped back and abstract. So I found an iron ore mine in the Forest of Dean, which related to the red pigment on the walls. And the Forest of Dean was close enough to the cathedral for there to be a kind of relationship. So the whole landscape there suddenly felt like this incredible sort of displacement of materials. The cathedral itself excavated and thrown up as a monument, leaving a hole in the ground somewhere, and then these traces of colour that had been excavated from the mine. Also creating a kind of taproot back into a history that had also been erased. So this meant that my relationship with materials completely changed and became, intensely about their potency and their history and their capacity to kind of unearth narrative or content in some way or shape or form. And gradually over time, this evolved into a series of journeys across the country looking for I went into a sort of nerdish sort of investigation into pigment and sort of pigments that would be found in medieval wall painting, and so that all naturally led to looking at the earth colours, but also looking at colours like azurite and ultramarine and kind of vermilion, these other quite sort of special colours that were the bright colours, the non-earthy colours. And I found that they all had this this kind of history and this kind of weight and materiality, and that they had been used in the past with those qualities in mind. That colour wasn't used arbitrarily. It wasn't just used for its sort of aesthetic properties or its vibrancy necessarily. It was used for its capacity to contain and to communicate other things. And an obvious example of that is the use of ultramarine, which is, it's an expensive pigment, but it was used over other substitutes because it was thought to connect heaven and earth. It was a magical, it had magical properties that were more than the sum of its parts, if you like. I soon realised that these pigments, there's no ultramarine in the UK, obviously, and it comes from the gates of heaven, which is in fact in Afghanistan. In the medieval times, it was the gates of heaven. But I soon realised that, like, searching for these practically extinct traces of colour across the UK. I mean, there are sites and pits and places all over the place, but they're no longer working and they no longer produce colour, and the industry's died. So I found less and less of them, but what I did find was these huge lakes of colour in certain landscapes, certain ex-coal mining landscapes. And during my travels, I would quite often use Google Earth to navigate my way around the country to find places. And I'm just thinking about the sort of imagery. I would be looking at that kind of thing from above and seeing colour in a condition and in a quantity that was like nowhere else. And then approaching these sites, they would look something like that on the ground. So there was a real difference between these kind of precious earth pigments that had been used in the past, and then these huge lakes of colour which were forming in the landscape. Gradually over time, I contacted the Coal Authority, who are the government organisation who are given the task of remediation, land remediation. They're essentially clearing up the polluting aftermath of the coal mining industry. And their role now is to prevent polluting waters from entering into rivers and the drinking aquifer. And these mine water treatment sites, which I'm referring to, essentially pull up polluting minerals, which we'll hear more about in a minute from Sue, I'm sure. Pull up these polluting minerals, pump them up. When the coal mine stopped being worked, the pumps that kept them from flooding, kept them able to be worked, were turned off. And so the water levels gradually rose, and the coal mines, the networks of coal mines, began to fill up with water again. And after a couple of decades, that water started to seep out into rivers and lakes. And so the problem of pollution became really visible. So you would see this kind of colour entering into rivers and canals. So at the end of the 90s, this became a real problem and it had to be dealt with. And so the Coal Authority were tasked with building these huge mine water treatment schemes, which essentially turned those pumps back on again so that the mine water could be pumped out of the mines, brought up onto the surface where the soluble minerals would become insoluble, they would oxidize, settle out as ochre, and looking like that, and separate from the clear water. So water and ochre separated from one another. And then the clear water is gradually reintroduced back into the water system again, leaving this ochre sludge in these huge vats of. I'm just looking through some images here. Huge vats of sort of, they're like swimming pool sized vats of colour. There's the image I'm looking for. So that's what is around the country times about 100. There's a lot of these sites, of course, and there's a lot of these mines as well, although mines that they came from. So for me personally, it became very clear that this was a pigment like the other pigments I had been using, and so it just became a question of looking at how I could use it and turn it into a material that could be used as pigment for paint. But it also, and so it began a kind of long kind of investigation into 5 particular sites, and these 5 sites I've just laid out on the grass here because there's a sort of geographic relevance to the way they're laid out. The 5 sites were sort of picked on because they seemed to me to be really interesting in terms of their context. There were a number of different conditions that were sort of supporting this, partly to do with the geography, partly to do with the sort of setting and the geography, but then partly also to do with the sort of quality of the colour. And so I've been working with these 5 sites for the past 3 or 4 years, and I found that it's been working with the material from the sites has changed the way that I think about making work and what making work is, and in fact the work that comes from these sites has sort of evolved into, I mean, I suppose I make landscape paintings, but they're sort of paintings that are, if you like, the landscape paints itself, and it is kind of a co-maker, if you like, in the process, and I don't really think necessarily about the paintings that come out of them as a sort of separate thing from the sites. So the site itself is very connected and linked to all of the different elements that emerge from that point. So, for example, this is a bag of saltburn ochre, and it comes. This is the site there. That's on the northeast coast, up just south of Middlesbrough. And I mean, it's an amazing place, and it's an amazing location, and it has an incredible history. But it was an incredible colour because it seemed to me that it was the brightest colour coming from the darkest and deepest mines in the whole country. So there were these kind of sort of moments that showed me about, or kind of revealed to me aspects about the landscape that I would have otherwise not known about or not seen. So to kind of sum up, I suppose the way that I'm approaching this work is to, in a sense, use the pigment that comes from these sites, which by the way is, and I sort of forget this fact because I'm so involved in using it. It was a waste material. It is a waste material, and it was sent to landfill. For up until about 2014, it was just sent directly to landfill. Just the settling ponds is what they're called. They would be scooped out, and the material would be dumped. So, working with the Coal Authority, that's not happening anymore, and it's being diverted to other things, and pigment being one of them. And so there's a really kind of important sort of opportunity here to divert this pigment from being sent to landfill and being kind of like put back into the land again to being used as a pigment to make paint with. And what I'm interested in is how that pigment and that paint can be used as a kind of vehicle to sort of reflect back on the landscape that it's come from, so that it becomes a sort of a kind of opener, and it makes that landscape visible and like exposes its history its social history, its economic history, and becomes sort of introduced back into the kind of sort of process of human interaction with the landscape, but in a way which acknowledges, you know, that we're at a critical turning point or tipping point, if you like, and that our use and ways of working with the landscape or existing with landscape have to radically change from now on. I think I'll leave it at that because it's probably my time up.
Thank you, Anja. That was brilliant. I could hand you over to Sue. Thank you.
Yeah, I think I'll be telling a slightly different story because I'll come at it more from how the ochre is formed more naturally, and I'm going to start talking about pyrite or fool's gold. And I've got a couple of pieces here that we can pass round. Do you mind?
And would you like me to take
You can take that. I've got a little magnifier if you want to have a good look at it. And there's also some pictures we can pass. Do you want both of those? This is pyrite, and we all know it as fool's gold. It's been known for a very long time. It's got this bright golden gleam that is what made everybody think that it was gold, and there's been a lot of confusion over the years. It's actually the mineral iron sulfide, and as we go on through, we'll see what implication that has actually got for the formation of ochre. I think a little bit to start with about how it first formed. So I'm afraid since I'm a geologist, there's a bit of geology coming up. One of the ways that it's formed, it's not the only way that pyrite is formed, is deep down in the ocean, probably about 2,000 metres down, where there are hot water vents called hydrothermal veins. They're often called black smokers, and you may have seen them on the television when they've taken these submersibles down, and you see these black smokers producing all this stuff. Well, that is very, very fine iron pyrites or iron sulfide, and eventually they will stop producing that, and you can see on one of those pictures all the little golden crystals that form inside the chimneys. And they eventually stop producing the black smoke, and they are sort of dead then, and then they will collapse, and over a great length of time they will form massive sulfide deposits. I'll mention one a bit later. There's one at the bottom of Portugal and Spain called the Iberian Pyrite Belt, and it is the largest sort of deposit of iron pyrite in the world, and it is mined, and you'll see the problems that have come from the mining of that in a minute. A thing about pyrite is it's been mined in this country. I don't know whether anybody's ever been to Anglesey, but this is Paris Mountain in Anglesey. Sorry. And if you have been to Anglesey, this is an amazing site there. It's called Paris Mountain, and in the 18th century it was the largest copper mine in the world. And mining there dates back to the Bronze Age. I think you've probably got the wrong picture there, it's that one. It was mined open cast. But what amazes me is that landscape there started as black smokers at the bottom of the sea about 440 million years ago. So when you go there, you're actually walking on where black smokers were and where on the base of the ocean was. So it's our one chance to walk on ancient black smokers. Now that is full of pyrite, and it also had copper and zinc and lead, sulfides as well, but it was the copper that was mined. And if you go to a little village nearby called Amluk, you can learn all about the copper mining industry that there was. But the reason why they're that colour now is because the sulphides have been oxidised, and the iron sulphide that wasn't mined there, it was the copper, has formed now different iron oxides, because iron can form a variety of oxides, all with these glorious colours. And so that's what's happened there. It's a very acidic environment, and they have had problem at Paris Mountain. They had to drain some of it from what was underground because there used to be sort of pollution of the rivers there. And there's not really any vegetation. If you look carefully, you can just about see some heather growing, and heather likes an acidic environment, but that's just about all that is growing there. But all those colours are the different oxides of iron. And I think one of the next pictures sort of crept its way out. Pyrite has had quite an interesting history. It was one of the ways that they first made fire. I think this one's probably already gone round. And it is more effective to make fire with pyrite than with just flint. It gives you a hotter spark, and so it catches fire more. And back in the sort of times gone by, they created something called a striker light, which was a sort of thing that was portable. They could take fire with them, and it was a flint and pyrite with some lichen or dried fungus or something like that, so that they could transport fire. So it was one of the first ways of transporting fire, and they've been used for thousands of years. And you've got a couple of pictures on there, which is see the mummy that came out of the Alps. They actually found a striker light with him. And right up into the 19th century, the Inuits, as they were, travelling around, would take striker lights with them. So pyrite has been extremely useful to us. It's had other uses as well, and I'll just briefly do this. I've only done sort of one other. It used to be used as the main way to make sulphuric acid. It's not the way that sulphuric acid is made now, but it used to be. And this one is showing you that sulphuric acid was made from the pyrite by oxidising it, and that made substances called alums, which were then used as mordants in the dyeing industry, and that all led in and sort of was part of the Industrial Revolution, because that was at that time that all these chemicals and what have you were being made and used. So pyrite has been quite useful. It's not all good news about pyrite, but there has been uses, and it was the main way that sulphuric acid was made back in the 1800s. Pyrite is responsible, and this is sort of linking in with Onya's. It's what's responsible for the natural formation of ochre, and I'll pass this round. I don't know whether anybody has there's two there, been there. Ochre is sort of another name for iron oxide, and there's more than one iron oxide. And these are ochre mines in France, in Provence, at a little, or near a little place called Roussillon. The ochre has formed in sands, and when those sands were actually deposited, they probably would have been a greyish, greenish colour. And because of aerated water percolating through the sands, it has oxidised the iron sulphide to iron oxides and formed all that variety of colours in there. About 100 million years ago, they would have all been grey. And now they're this glorious colour. They're not mined there anymore, so it's a wonderful sort of tourist attraction, a spectacular place to visit. And the reason why you've got different colours there, it will have depended on how much oxygen was available to do the oxidation of the original iron sulphide. And that will affect which of the oxides that you form. Those sorts of colours, and we're going way back now, were the colours that were used in the cave paintings. So that's Lascaux. and they had all of their orangey colours. If you've ever been there, or to any cave paintings, they used a lot of ochre in the cave paintings. And that other picture on there is just a picture of Roussillon village itself, where all of the houses are rendered or painted in the varying ochre colours. And they still do produce some ochre pigment down there. You can go to shops down there that are have got locally produced ochre pigment. And the Romans used ochre from that area in their pottery glazes. So the ochre industry in that part of France really goes back quite a long way. Pyrite is not all nice though. It's not a very nice substance really, because if it starts to be oxidized, it's a sort of self-sustaining cycle, and it causes problems with coal mines. Not just this, but it also causes coal mines to catch fire. And just passing around here, coal has a lot of pyrite sort of particles within it, and if a coal mine catches fire, they cannot put it out. And these are just some pictures from America where they've had some coal mines on fire there. That's not the only place. If you search, you can find coal mines all over that have caught fire because of this oxidation reaction. I'm going to go back to this Iberian pyrite belt because that is where the Rio Tinto is, and Rio Tinto means Red River, and it is part of that belt. It's quite complicated, the geology of the formation of that belt, but the Rio Tinto is stained red from the iron oxides, the ochres produced from the oxidation of the pyrite in the deposit. The river's highly acidic, nothing lives in it, and it's been like that for hundreds of years. You can see an open cast mine there, just down the bottom left. That was once the largest open mine pit in the world. I think it's not working so much now, and that it's flooded up to about level 16, I think. They mined it for copper, zinc and lead, but there was also some gold and some silver there as well. And on that picture of the pit, you can actually see the oxidation of the pyrite where it's turned yellow. When they opened the pit up, it wouldn't have been that colour originally, but as the air got to it, it's oxidised it. You can see the different shades, the different colours going round that pit from that. Again, drainage waters are called tailings, and we've already talked a little bit about drainage waters. They are not only acidic from anything that's come from pyrite, but from places like this, they contain toxic materials like cadmium and arsenic. So the tailings are really quite nasty things. This region is reckoned to be the most affected region in the world from contamination by acid mine waste, because it is in such a large area. The problem with these tailings ponds, and this is again the effect on the landscape, is that they have to be kept. I mean, Anya's mentioned these ones here. They're not always in such safe places as that. Sometimes they're in much more dangerous places than that, high up in mountains. And there's been many a disaster, and I've just popped that on there. The very top picture is a tailings pond or lake that is dammed. They're very acidic, toxic and full of iron oxide, like we've talked about these lakes. But the problem is, should the dam burst, then large areas are contaminated. And there's pictures there of Brazil. And in this year, in January, the very top picture, that was when one of the dams burst, and it killed, well, 134 were dead and 252 unaccounted for, and it spilled 12 million cubic metres of iron waste down the valley. The two pictures underneath are the same area. It's in Brazil, it's a pyrite area again, and that was in 2015, and that time that dam burst, it shot 60 million cubic metres of these tailings down and killed, it didn't kill as many people actually, it only killed 19 people, even though it was a much bigger flow. The one that happened this year was the worst. So pyrite has two sides to it. It's been a very useful mineral, but it's also got this side to it, which links in with here, because we get a lot of the pyrite, a lot of the stuff coming out of the coal mines has got pyrite coming out with it, because coal has pyrite in it. That oxidises, and that's where we're getting these from. So, you know, that's where the link comes. But I don't think these poor people were able to, you know, make the use of that as it is here. So that's pyrite in a very short time.
Oh, thank you very much for that, Sue. So now we'll open up the free exchange to our audience. So our audience is welcome to join in, ask our speakers questions, or equally sit back and listen. We also welcome questions from our Twitter audience. So Jessica here will be live tweeting so people can join in online. So I'd like to open it up to anything. Thank you.
So Sue mentioned about the ochre originally being grey.
Yes.
Wondered if Anja, you could mention about the permanence of any of the artwork
Sorry?
that you make. If Anja could perhaps mention about the permanence of some of the artwork.
Yeah.
Because if it's changing over a geological timescale, what's the effect on your kind of artistic timescale?
Well, these are what you might call young iron oxides. I think that would be the term for them. So they're at the moment they're ferrihydrites rather than, I mean, their crystal kind of mineral formation is ferrihydrite rather than goethite or hematite.
Yes.
So those would be the minerals that would be a more stable iron oxide. Goethite and hematite are probably what is formed in the pictures from France.
The dark reddish one in Brazil is probably more likely hematite, isn't it?
Or it could be, yes, it could be hematite. Yes.
Yeah, I think so.
But I mean, I think that the crystal structure has a bearing on the acidity and various other kind of chemical properties that are in the, you know, each of these iron oxides vary, and that's in this country alone. So, but they're so they're evolving as minerals, because they've only just oxidised. The materials that you're talking about that were in Roussillon have been oxidised for a long time, haven't they?
Yes.
So that the geological time frame is different, and the effect of that is that the mineral is gradually going from an amorphous to a crystalline structure. I think.
You're also changing the iron. If I don't want to go into the chemistry, but there's two forms of iron. They used to be called ferrous and ferric, and that's what you're getting the change between, to go from the grey to the orangey colour. So you're actually sort of changing the form of the iron that's in there.
Also, and maybe this is something to sort of talk about in relation to other things as well, but the effect of intense heat has on these pigments. It also changes their chemical makeup and structure. So the two pigments that are here, if I pass them round, that one, that's a raw ferrihydrite from Saltburn, and I've done nothing to it. That's exactly how it comes out of the ground, and these colours here have been burned at 600 degrees. So the structure's changed from a ferrihydrite to probably more like a
That's
a
more like
hematite.
hematite,
Yes,
isn't it?
it is.
Yes,
Yeah. So
definitely.
that process of burning also stabilizes the structure to an extent. Yeah, they're very strong. Yeah, I maybe should have mentioned that. Oh well.
So going back then on, you're saying that your paintings will last quite a long time then, that the process,
Yeah.
you won't see a quick change.
No. I mean, these are very, very subtle and very slow. I mean, I visually, I don't think there's any change at all. But there may be some chemical evolution. But
we have a question. This person has
a block of hematite at home that is quite dark and shimmery grey. Will it too oxidize and turn red, or is hematite a more stable oxide? Hematite or hematite?
it's possible if you rub it, if you rub this block of hematite, it will go red. Yeah.
It's hematite.
If
be
you
red.
yeah, so
Be red, I would thought.
yeah, it will look grey on the outside, and then if you rub it into a piece of paper or a surface, you will see red come off it. Maybe this could be a live experiment. Yeah.
Oh dear.
Thank you for that person asking that question. And has anybody got any questions from the audience?
When you say paint, what do you mix the natural tones with? Oils or?
Yeah, well, they'll mix with pretty much anything, really.
What do you use?
Well, I've been interested in watching the materials behave in different mediums, and so I've worked a lot with water because it seems to be the medium that the materials carried in, and so it seemed like a kind of like its natural habitat to be in water. So I've used water, and for the purposes of binding, I've used watercolour gum arabic to fix the pigment. But what I found was that that the pigment behaved in a particular way in watercolour that it doesn't behave in oil. And so I was quite interested in sort of following those properties and kind of seeing what it would reveal. And so some of the paintings that came from that, I think that's one of them. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So that's two separate.
Yeah. It was a particular that material came from South Wales, and it belonged to a mine which was unusually above you, so to speak. So it was inside the mountain, and the mine water treatment site where I dug out this colour, this one that I've already passed around. Where is it? Oh, well. Oh, I don't know where it is now. There, that one.
Okay, so what
That
was this on you?
That's Tannigarn in South Wales, and it's so standing at ground level on that site, looking at this, the mountain is above you, and the water containing the pyrite minerals and other things is pouring downwards through the mine workings and then into this scheme. And there was something about the kind of fluidity of that process and that place that kind of struck me as really significant. And the material that came from it has a particular kind of viscosity, a sort of a heaviness that the other ones don't have. It's just feels different. And I think it was that started to inform the way that the images emerged and took shape. But I've used oil as well.
You were just starting to touch on a thing I was thinking about, actually, but there's a lot of talk about the pigment as a material in itself. Do you feel there's a bit of a sort of boundary to cross, going from the substance itself to the composition, the making of a piece of art, or do you think that one naturally quite arises from the other?
That's a really interesting question that I have is constantly kind of with me, really, because I think I'm not interested in colour. I'm interested in material, but I'm interested in like how that material communicates, and by using it, it opens up the possibilities of its capacity to kind of communicate. And so, in a way, you know, painting with it in a particular way, it is a way of trying to kind of express out of it its material qualities and properties. And some pigments are kind of leaning towards something quite particular. And so the material I've just talked about had this kind of sort of viscous sort of quality that felt very quite like connected to the human body. It was also it was sort of more earthy and much more sort of, it felt much more closely linked to the landscape as a kind of formation, as a sort of process of formation. Whereas saltburn, the bright colour that's been passed around, has a sort of very different quality, and it's very transparent. And so there was something about using oil to open up this transparency, just to see it. So it's like very, very bright, and you can put layer after layer after layer, and it still has kind of light and brightness going through it. And it's kind of ironic because it's from the deepest mines, the darkest places. So yeah, I mean, the question about, like, in a way, the landscape started to kind of come through the materials and start to take shape through the way that the materials were behaving, and I kind of use that. I sort of exploit those qualities, really, rather than trying to sort of impose something onto them as much as possible, I think. Is that what you were kind of asking?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, whether it felt like a fight to take a step from that natural substance itself to a sort of human expression, or whether there was a sort of flow from one to the other. But yeah, I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
There's a definite link through the process.
Yeah, I mean, it comes back to the landscape and the context, and somehow kind of this material becomes a sort of vehicle for communicating something or opening up something, you know, without necessarily kind of being didactic about it. It's an exploration and a kind of a sort of a set of questions that are sort of picked away at in the studio, really. Yeah.
Cool.
I'm very interested in sort of the process of your practice. So that for me, it's one entire work. So the engagement in the landscape, the experience of the landscape, through to thinking about what's coming out and using the material, through to experimenting with the material, through to then creating the artwork. So for me, and then I've looked at your documentation as well. So for me, each stage is an artwork, and then the entirety is an artwork. Is that the way you think about it, or?
I think it completely, and it's very difficult to separate any particular moment. So the pigment as a raw thing from the painting that's made from it, from the place that it's come from the whole process of trying to, you know, kind of, one thing is completely infused and part of the next, and this became especially heightened or highlighted when I realised that these were also these sites are also paintings. They have the kind of physical visual appearance of watercolour paintings from you know, we have this opportunity to, or ability to see them from Google Earth, and there they are in the landscape, and I mean they are paintings. And so there's something about their kind of their sort of self-confidence and their inadvertent kind of existence as already existing images that was really interesting, and in a certain way kind of and I think also they became like, it became very much like I was aware that I'm working with a system and a cycle of exchange and change and transformation, and that there's no one point that can be kind of separated off or defined as an end point. There's a constant kind of sort of remaking in a way. So yeah, I mean, I think these sites, it's a bit like Roussillon, which is now a tourist destination. It's not a working site, but actually I think I have an aspiration, and I'm working with the Coal Authority to turn these sites into public spaces, so they do become visible and they do become kind of experienced as paintings, and that the process of land remediation that's going on there becomes actually part of the language of the landscape, and becomes a tool for sort of connecting back to those places which have become, you know, kind of neglected and kind of fenced off and overlooked, and sort of like don't really want to talk about that anymore because it's, you know, because of all that sort of nasty stuff that happened, and you know, and actually that's a kind of like suppression, and I think these sites are sort of an expression of all of that in a really sort of transformative and illuminating way. So yeah.
Was there a question?
I've got a question for
So Anja said that you're not so interested in colour, you're interested in material. So I wondered for Sue, as somebody with a geology background, what's your relationship with colour? I mean, do you see colour different to me? If you see blue, do I see green? I mean, do you see ochre and think that's such and such, or do you think that's a nice colour?
No, I think it's the first one. Yeah, it is really, you know. I think in my chemistry background as well as my geology one, you do link colours with particular elements, you know, so blues and greens with copper and stuff like that. And it's the same with the iron in the oranges, but also greys and greens with iron. So yes, I'm afraid I do sort of have that hat on, I think, more than, you know, it's a lovely colour, yes, I like that, but then I'll look at it and think, oh, well, I think that might have some copper in it, you know, and so, yeah, it does work like that for me. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and that, I mean, that's really great because it really opens up the kind of relationship with matter, doesn't it? And also it kind of cuts across our maybe sometimes quite strange relationship with colour, because colour has become sort of I don't know, sort of so many different things. There are so many colours that it's hard to find words for them. And it's hard to connect them to anything.
Yes.
They become thingless, don't they?
Yes.
Whereas you're talking about copper and blue and
Blues and
green,
greens, yes.
and I know exactly what you mean. So that sort of dematerialisation
Yes.
that we
Yes.
generally sort of experience colour
Yes.
as, or
Yeah. And other elements have a much wider variety. If you take vanadium, it can have a wide variety of colours. You can have about 7 different colours, depending on how much it's been oxidised. So, you know, it's quite interesting to have a look at that for me. And when we look at our mineral collection at the Society, we've been sort of classifying all that. It's amazing the colours that form naturally, you know, as minerals in the raw sort of thing. Beautiful, absolutely beautiful. Sorry?
Do you have a favourite colour?
My favourite colour, I don't know that I have one. Blues, mauves. Yeah, pink, I'll say pink because I'm a girl. No, but you know, minerals wise, I think to the blues and the purples and that sort of colour. Yeah.
So following on that from that question then, when you explore landscape, are you thinking geology?
Yeah. Drives my husband mad. Yes,
Yeah.
I do. I love to find out how it's been formed. I haven't been somewhere unless I've actually done some investigation, done some finding out, and actually looked to see what's gone on. So, you know, that's really one of my main interests in that respect. So, yes.
We have a question from Rob Miller, who's a previous free exchange artist. I tweeted about, I quoted you, I'm afraid, the viscosity and heaviness of this pigment in this work. And he's asking, is this heaviness possibly a reflection on our heaviness on the planet? I believe he said, though it says plant. I think he means heaviness on the planet.
that site, Tannigarn, is about an hour's drive away from a very special archaeological site on the Gower Peninsula, where in 1823 an excavation discovered a skeleton that was caked in red ochre. And she is known as the Red Lady of Paviland. And the dating has been all over the place, but I think the latest estimate is around 34,000 years old. And it's the oldest ochre burial in Europe. That makes it the oldest ochre burial in Europe. So there's something there about the relationship between ochre and humans and our kind of place in the world and our our not just our relationship with the planet, but our relationship with a particular material and how it's kind of been with us for a very, very, very long time as a kind of like, I suppose, like a sort of symbolic, sort of transforming material that connects things like life and death and rebirth, and in that sense, I'm talking about kind of a human weight and a human relationship with gravity and the earth and being, and so in a sense these materials are a kind of an extension of that relationship that's been so influential in the way that we are and behave and respond.
I also got a question about this specific work.
Now, knowing a little bit more the background or where this pigment comes from, I am even more compelled to ask if this vein effect is the behavior of the material, or if it was maybe planned ahead from you. Did you design these veins, or I don't know, is the material positioned in a specific place? Maybe it's coming down from how?
Yes, exactly.
Because
It is forming as it's the material performing or forming in water. So it's sort of creating a physical effect that exists on different scales as well. So it's sort of like the way a delta forms, or
What size is that?
it's 54 centimeters by something like that. Yeah. So yeah, it is the way the material is forming. And there was something to do with the fact that this pigment, it's got big fat particles, it's quite heavy, it's quite sort of, it's blood-like. I mean, it really is. It's sort of coincidental, but it is. And so there are just ways that it naturally wants to kind of form. I just let it do that. It's quite nice, actually, to let a painting just make itself.
Do you position it
On the paper, or is it maybe more of a non-absorbent surface?
The paper's got a tooth in it, but it's got some absorbency, so it kind of carries the material in a certain way.
Further to that question, I come from sort of a colour matching paint background. A few years ago, the fashion was a crackle finish, and that was sort of the principle that was based on. How much you've got to, it's a lot of trial and error to sort of get what you want to achieve, so it's fairly even. But this was used throughout the furniture industry to get the old sort of antique look, and it was all basically down to the medium that you used with the pigments, and depending on which medium, how much, you got these various different effects with it breaking and cracking. And once you got your formulation sorted out, then you can get it quite even.
That's really interesting. Would there be a kind of combination of two media that would be in opposition to each other, like oil and water, for example, or?
That was one way. Yeah, that's similar to the
Or resin.
well, the resin as well, but the hammerite paint, that sort of nice. That's obviously it's achieved in a similar way. But that again, it's I'm surprised they don't have more problems with that, because it's very difficult to control. But it does basically come down to the amount of solids you've got in your, say, your basic clear medium, that makes the difference of how it appears and it dries out.
Yeah, and presumably that's different with different pigments, different colours.
Yeah, and also whatever you're putting your paint onto.
Yeah, the surface, yeah. Which is exactly actually the case with, certain papers wouldn't. It wouldn't behave like that because it would not have the absorbency.
I was interested, so going back to you saying the shapes and the landscape, so from the aerial point of view, reminded me of I saw a relationship, so I wondered if there was a relationship in the shapes you created with your watercolour paintings to the shapes in the aerial view, or was there not a relationship, or coincidental, or?
I think that there are echoes all over the place that are incidental, and there are sort of apparitions of forms that seem to kind of reoccur in different sort of conditions or in different geological scales. So, I mean, you know, the sort of idea of the blood vessels and, you know, deltas and mountains and moles
Yes, yeah.
is probably more it. I mean, I do make quite constructed geometric paintings as well, and in those cases I'm working with a different sort of set of criteria in a way, which is lifting up ideas connected with perspectival devices and also to do with structures that exist below the ground and that are visible in the maps of the mines. But other than that, the shapes that and forms that appear in the works otherwise are and there is one picture which I don't have, but it's on my website, which is in a series from Cut Hill, where I was like I wanted to sort of see what happened when the colour was underwater and sort of record it. And so these paintings are made with paper suspended in pigment, and it's really a way of the pigment kind of is doing things under the unseen, and similarly these paintings kind of have echoes of mountains or sort of topographical kind of formations or sub-aqua formations. Yeah, so they and it is just a question of materials sort of doing what they want to do in if the conditions are there for them to do it.
Sorry, I've got lots of questions. I had a sort of question for you both, really, in terms of so we're talking about sense of place and landscape and geological sites and destruction of sites, and the effect of the landscape of mining or quarrying. So the question to you both, really, if I could start with you, Sue, is what you think should become of these sites. Should they just be left to nature? Should they be reformed, reused?
I think a lot of them are becoming more and more used for recreation. I mean, you've only got to look along the Nen Valley where they've dug out all of the gravel, and we've got one country park after another, and it's sort of creeping along. There are a lot of quarry sites that have been just left to overgrow. And that can give problems sometimes, I think, when maybe some more stone is required of the same sort. And I was on a trip only the other week, and people had to use the wrong stone to repair parts of a wall because the quarry, they couldn't get that stone anymore. So, you know, there's that side of it, that maybe, you know, things do need to be kept more open in some places to be able to get that for repair. I mean, I think a lot is down to recreation. I really do now. You know, I mean, just those ochre mines, they take in lots of money for the local community just to walk round and get covered in ochre like that. You get plastered. But, you know, so I think there is the case for a lot of it to be used in that way, like we have here. You know, sort of a lot of the Northamptonshire sites, Chester and what have you, are all based around stuff that's been mined out. So, yeah, so I think, you know, that's one good use for them.
Yeah, I agree, really. I mean, I think that it's you know, we lived in the very word landscape is it's constructed. There's so much of our surroundings are constructed, and quarries and pits and are just another sort of frame of that. And in a way, you know, when access to land is increasingly kind of contested and difficult and politicised, then I think that these places should be absolutely kind of open to people to kind of, you know, enjoy and like understand the history of the way the country has been chopped up and and displaced and moved around and all that, you know. And I think in a way, you know, it's a way of like, it's like kind of looking at a landscape and thinking, well, how did this form? Or, you know, it's such an insight into what you're standing on, and to have some knowledge of what went before, whether that's in geological timescales or more human timescales. And these, you know, these mine water treatment sites are, you know, they're current, they're live, they're not, they're functioning industrial sites. Actually, they're not sort of, they haven't gone into the kind of heritage sort of stage, and in order to kind of keep the rest of the landscape around them functioning, they have to keep going. And so they kind of like offer a sort of a slightly different kind of opening, but nonetheless I think it's one which is exposes a whole kind of knowledge of the landscape we're involved in.
Are there any more questions? Have we got two then? Okay. Right.
I've got a question about how do you
select the next location where to go, because it seems like you like to go yourself to mine the color, mine the pigments. Do you work maybe just with specific colors, or I don't know, maybe for now you're interested in ochre, so you go and search for a place where to collect it, or?
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested in. I think I suppose the you know, the kind of evolution of this is that it is interesting to encounter a place or a material that kind of signifies a place, and in whatever shape or form that might take. You know, it's not absolutely kind of defined to be, or it doesn't have to be pigment, but it is often pigment because I'm a painter and I have this relationship with paint and pigment. But at the same time, I'm interested in materials and materials that connect with particular places and maybe even sort of particular sort of histories and stuff. So and that really could be anything, and it depends on what I happen to be doing at the time. But that's not really answering the question, I think. But I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, it's a question of sort of keeping my eyes open, really, seeing what's interesting, you know, what sort of what's kind of interesting in a sort of usable way. Yeah.
I'm not sure to what extent this is exactly a question, but I really like a lot of the ideas you've been talking about. I think there's just tons of really interesting things in there, and a lot of them seem to sort of end up in this cancelling themselves out sort of place. So you're talking about the sort of huge scale of where these physical things are coming from, and then you're talking about ultimately colour becoming thingless, which I like the idea of. And you're quick to sort of talk about coincidental, the relationship between different structures and things like that, you know, so which I think is really, really good. But after all that, I'm thinking, so what's left? And what I'm really hearing is it's about the narrative. Do you think that's a fair take on it? I mean, that's what I'm getting as the big picture coming through, what the message is, if you like.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know that there's a message, but I think that things get kind of revealed along the way, perhaps, or kind of maybe provoked along the way. But I don't. I mean, I think there's some imperative here about, you know, kind of relationships with stuff and material and behaviours and perceptions and connections with things and places and other people and all that kind of stuff. I mean, I don't know what it is. I don't have kind of I don't have a sort of missionary zeal exactly. But I certainly have a sense of the potency of the material that I'm working with, and it's you know, the kind of urgency of its capacity to kind of like speak in one way or another.
Right.
And whatever that might be, though, you know, I don't know. I don't really know.
Just the doing of it, finding out, getting on.
Yeah, and I think, you know, I mean, I think the paintings are one kind of aspect that I kind of work sort of privately in my studio, and that happens to be something that I need to do. But you know, the paintings, where the paintings come from, is really the imperative, and I think the kind of illumination to understanding a sort of sense of place and identity and kind of connection, and you know, in some ways that manifests in. I mean, I won't go into this because it's too complicated, and we're probably running out of time. But there's an important aspect about language here, which is partly to do with what I was saying earlier about like kind of colour can't. The names for colours that we have can't possibly contain the quantities of colours that there are. And so our language sort of breaks down when it comes to naming our experience in general, and so in a sense, finding some new language to begin to like kind of identify what these are, these sites and the material coming from them, what that is, and their history and the kind of economies passed from them, is really important to me. To you know, that they're not anonymous, right? Because anonymity kind of equals sort of ignorance and non-existence in a way, and so you know, that big bag of pigment that is being passed around, or indeed this, you know, this is a colour that I hope will be used and become able to be circulated among people, and you know, exist on people's walls, and you know, colour their cars or whatever. I don't know, maybe not that, but that it's not just, you know, red. That it's called Cut Hill, and that it links directly back to a very particular place and a very particular sort of set of kind of pointers, and in a sense that's where the sort of imperative lies, really.
Okay.
So you would like to give identity to
A specific, maybe color that you find.
Yes. Yeah. But it's the identity. Just one thing. It's not my imposition. It's not me imposing. These are the names of the places. They already have this. They already have this identity. It's just that it's not very. It's not very visible at the moment. So it's kind of like giving visibility through the name.
Okay, sorry to interrupt. So
No, it's all right.
Thank you very much. It's really sort of interesting discussion and great to hear different perspectives. And so I've just got a few notes that I've made throughout that to reflect on what we've been hearing. So Onya was saying I'm interested in how materials communicate. The landscape started to come through the materials. The landscapes of the sites are also paintings. They're already existing images, turning these sites into visible spaces. Sue, you were talking about that you link colours with elements, that you see the element and not the colour. We were talking about the Red Lady, the 34,000-year-old oldest ochre burial in Europe. So talking about the relationship between ochre and humans. And that led on to thinking about human relationships with the earth, and that material is blood-like, echoes that are incidental, and blood vessels and deltas, so talking about different scales. So talking about Google Earth and how you see these landscapes, and then going down to the microcosm of the material itself. You're talking about how the word landscape is actually constructed, so that was then reflecting back to landscape as a whole and how our landscapes are constructed through human interference. And then that led on to talking about place and identity and connection, and how you're discovering a new language to describe these landscapes, and how you want these colours to be called, named after the places, so Cut Hill Red. So thank you ever so much for that. That was truly lovely. Before we end, do our usual upcoming events advertising. This Saturday we have a wild learning event, Sound and Vision, with sound artist, musician and beatboxer Jason Singh, where participants will be exploring pattern and repetition. Then on the 22nd of June, a second wild learning event, The Human Theremin, with Stuart Moore, in which participants will explore how sound creates an emotional connection to a place. And on the 28th of June, we have an artist talk with the Owl Project, who will be launching the result of their residency at Fine Shade Wood. And lastly, on the 13th of July, a wild sharing event, which is wood carving with Alex Stevens, where each participant will make a wooden object that directly links with their connection to a forest. So once again, thank you all for coming, Sue and Onya, people watching online. Thanks to Martin for live streaming, Jessica for tweeting, the Arts Council have funded this evening, and to East Carlton Park and Corey Borough Council for hosting us. Thank you and good night.